Chapter 8 of Clog Shop Chronicles by John Ackworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For Better, for Worse. Part 1. The Dilemma. Johnty Harrop the Minder had got into difficulties, and although thereby he had demonstrated the sagacity and justified the prophecy of popular opinion in Beckside, this was not regarded as any palliation of his mistake. In fact, from the senators of the Clog Shop down to the frequenters of the Bridge Inn, the verdict had been " Sarve him reet." After the usual number of juvenile flirtations with the girls of the village, he had eventually turned his back on them all and married a Clough Ender. Now, as Clough End was a very modern mill village of no account whatever, but pretentious and aggressive in inverse ratio to its importance, its sedate and elderly neighbour Beckside had been compelled to treat it much as ancient Jerusalem treated Samaria, and no Clough Ender was of any account in the older village. But Johnty's offence was aggravated by the fact that he was regarded as a very likely lad and somewhat of a plum in the marriage market, so that feminine Beckside was scandalised at his lack of taste and decency in passing by his own people. Moreover, the elect lady was a renegade Becksider. She belonged to a poor but somewhat proud and ambitious family, which years ago had preferred Clough End to Beckside, which was, of course, an inexpiable offence. When she was a girl, Susy Stones and her elder sister had shown a decided aversion to going to the mill, and so the Stoneses, who were all supposed to be cursed with forced pride, removed to Clough End, where the daughters became dressmakers. Susy, the younger of these two, was undeniably pretty, a typical white-skinned, dark-eyed Lancashire lass. And whilst the Beckside girls felt that this gave a provoking justification to Johnty, the Clough End young men regarded him as an unscrupulous poacher. As a mule minder, Johnty got good wages, and must have saved money, so that nobody was greatly surprised when he indulged a long-cherished purpose by taking the large 4-room cottage next to Long Ben's, so that he could begin housekeeping in the same house his mother had done, and in the house wherein he himself was born, although according to current ideas it was much too large for a newly married couple. Johnty filled the house with new and stylish furniture, but when Mrs. Johnty arrived, she poured scorn on the chest of mahogany drawers with glass knobs which her husband had bought with great pride, and insisted upon it being exchanged for a new fangled thing called a sideboard. Every housewife in Beckside was outraged, for a chest of mahogany drawers, especially with the added and uncommon glory of glass knobs, was the last ambition of every wifely heart. Before feminine sentiment had got over this shock, it was passed round in tragic whispers that Sue Johnty had got a sewing machine, and though this was the very first article of the kind that had been seen in Beckside, and every woman in the place was dying to inspect it, yet only a few of the baser sort ever made the attempt, all the self-respecting ones feeling that they would be morally compromised if by any means they should appear to be countenancing such unheard-of extravagance. Very soon it became a fixed opinion in the village that Mrs. Johnty was a dressy, extravagant, wasteful woman, and for a time this was marrow and fatness to the Minder. It was clearly a case in which envy was at work, and the implied compliment to his own judgment in selecting a partner and to his wife's accomplishments greatly delighted him, whilst his wife's brightness and ability gave added zest to his pleasure, and her utter unconsciousness of the sensation she was making gave piquancy to the whole situation. The Beckside women kept very much aloof from Johnty's wife, but imitated her in their best bonnets, and made their baby clothes as nearly like hers as possible, whilst the men shook their heads over her finery, expressed strong commiseration for Johnty, but straightened themselves up whenever she passed them, and followed her with unconcealable admiration in their eyes as long as she was in sight. After a while, however, Johnty became uneasy. The strict ideas of domestic economy which obtained in the village, and in which he had been brought up, slowly began to assert themselves, and as his house became better furnished and his 2 children better clothed, he began to seriously regret that he had commenced his married life by turning up practically all his wages to his wife, according to well-established Beckside usage. Having commenced, however, he found it difficult to stop, especially as his wife was so manifestly proud of the confidence reposed in her, and really gave him no opportunity of altering matters. Little by little also, though he scarcely ever heard a word drop, the very pronounced opinions of the villagers on the subject began to percolate somehow into Johnty's mind, and very soon he suspected that the neighbours were on the look out for an opportunity of discussing the matter with him, which, of course, made him more anxious to avoid it. About this time the mill began to run short time, and Johnty took the news home to his wife with a heavy heart, and was confirmed in his fears of his wife's unthriftiness by the light way in which she received the news. " Ne'er mind, lad," she said, " it's an ill wind 'at blows noabry ony good. Tha'll be able to tak' me an' th' childer a walk a bit i' th' afternoons." The next Friday she brought him a fancy pipe and a quarter of scented tobacco from Duxbury, and poor Johnty, though his heart was sad, was so entirely under the influence of this little wife of his that at her bidding he smoked the new pipe and tobacco the same night, feeling all the time as if it would choke him. Mule minding is piecework, and so, as she never thought of asking, Susy did not know exactly what her husband earned, and the Minder was strongly tempted to keep back more of his wages than he had previously done, and save it up for the dark day he felt sure was coming. But instead of doing so, he went to the other extreme, and gave her almost every farthing he earned, to prevent her running into debt. This meant pinching himself in 20 little ways, and running up small scores at the Clog Shop and other places, as was usual when work was not plentiful. When he came in from his work one day about this time, his wife held up her wee mouth and displayed 2 new false teeth. Poor Johnty! It was so like this wife of his, and they really did so effectually remove the only weak spot on her beautiful face that he hadn't the heart to say anything unkind about them. But knowing what a buzz of tattle they would cause in the village, false teeth being rare in Beckside at that time, he made a hasty tea and got out into the lanes to brood over his anxieties. The Minder realised that the time for action had arrived, but how to act with the least possible disturbance was a problem that sorely perplexed him. As he walked he thought, and thought rapidly for him, so that all unconsciously in crossing the Padfoot fields he overtook 2 women, Lottie Speck and an old flame of his, Martha Royle. Martha was evidently excited about something, and craning out her long lean neck she was saying to Lottie, " Han they'n gowd plate on 'em, and they tell me hoo's in debt all o'er Duxbury." Then she caught sight of Johnty, blushed, as red as a peony, and began to talk loudly and excitedly about some totally different subject, in pretended obliviousness of his proximity. The Minder passed them with a monosyllabic salutation, and turning at the first stile, took a short cut for the village. The prospect of debt and of impending exposure was now added to his anxieties, for there was no room for doubt as to Martha Royle's meaning, and he shuddered to think of his wife and her 2 false teeth in the hands of this scandal-loving gossip. Johnty made straight for home, and somewhat roughly demanded his supper. His plate of porridge was placed before him, and by its side, on a little white plate, was set a fragrant roasted apple, and his wife playfully plucked at his beard and called him " owd Grumpy " in a merry and altogether irresistible way. But Johnty was in no mood for sport, and after eating his porridge he left the apple as a silent protest against extravagance, and went out again, for if the truth must be told, he was afraid to stay alone with his wife just then. Somehow, when Beckside men were in trouble, they seemed to gravitate by a sort of natural law towards the Clog Shop, and so the Minder, after walking aimlessly up and down the road past the chapel 2 or 3 times, turned in at Jabe's. " Well, hast made owt on 'em ?" he asked as he entered, but Jabe was not at his bench as he expected, and turning towards the fireplace he saw the Clogger sitting before the fire, and the clogs of some invisible wearer projecting out of the nook. " Wor art talkin' abaat ?" asked Jabe in answer to Johnty's question. " Them owd clogs o' mine. Hast bin able for to mak' owt on 'em Well, if Aw han, Aw'm abaat t' on'y mon i Lancashire as could, an' if tha brings 'em here agean Aw'll chuck 'em on th' feire," and Jabe's short leg was riding up and down across the other at a frantic rate, whilst his lips pursed out and his eyebrows bristled quite threateningly. " Aw'll pay thee for 'em on Setterday," replied Johnty very humbly. " Ay, if tha doesn't forget. But come here wi' thee. Aw want thee," and the Clogger moved to another seat to make room for the Minder. " Wot's come o'er thee ?" he demanded as Johnty sank into a seat. " Tha used goa in for th' fanciest clugs i' Beckside afore tha were wed. Wot's up wi' thee ?" Johnty had recently fallen into the habit of feigning avariciousness and worldly cuteness as a cover for his wife's extravagance, and so he answered with an attempt at a cunning wink —" A chap as hes his way ta mak' has ta be curful naadays. Neaw, Aw've gan o'er smokin'. It's wasteful," he added, as Jabe passed him a corpulent brown effigy of Punch, which served the cloggery as a tobacco jar. The Clogger cast upon Johnty a slow, comprehensive, but quietly contemptuous look as he said —" Oh, tha's started o' scrattin', hes ta ? Then that'll be whey tha hasna paid thy pew rent this last 2 quarters." Johnty felt there was something ominous in the Clogger's tones, but he prepared to brave it out, and replied —" Oh, well, Aw'll fotch it up when we goa on full time agean. But if a chap's ta mak' owt aat, he hes ta tak' cur of his brass, tha knows." " Aw ye'r tha tak's cowd tay to th' factory. Aw reckon that'll be to save tay wayter money," continued Jabe, but though the tone was natural, it increased Johnty's misgivings. " Ay," he answered very slowly. " Aw liken cowd tay best, tha knows." " Wot makes me sweet soa ?" Jabe gave a most mysterious grunt, and then, after a few long deliberate pulls at his pipe, he looked steadily into the fire, and shaking his grey fringed head, said with great impressiveness —" It's an awful thing when a Christian mon starts a lyin', Jonathan." The Minder winced, flushed angrily, and then demanded —" Lyin' ? Whoa's lyin' ?" The clogs protruding from the chimney corner crossed themselves as an indication of quickened interest, but Jabe sat still, ignoring Johnty's question. At length, turning and looking the Minder straight in the face, he said —" Tha knows as well as Aw know 'at aw thy brass goes to bey fine feathers for yon fine brid o' thine." " Whoa says soa ?" cried Johnty, and there was anger and fear and pathetic expostulation in his voice as he went on —" Yo' talkin' like that, an' yo' know nowt abaat it. There isn't a cleaner, willinger, quieter wench i' th' clough, an' Aw've ne'er yerd her say a word agean the warst on yo'. Yo' ought ta be shawmed o' yo'rsels." There was a low whistle of surprise from far into the chimney, presumably from the wearer of the obtruding clogs. Then Jabe, waving Johnty back into his seat, said, very mildly for him —" Aw'm sorry for thee, lad, reet enough, but whey doesn't tha awter it?" " Haa conna ?" cried poor Johnty, and instantly could have bitten his tongue out as he discovered he had given himself away. " Tha can be th' mestur i' thy own haase, sure//," came from out of the chimney, and Sam Speck's face became visible through the smoke as he eagerly leaned forward. " Ay, as tha used to be," said Jabe without looking at him, and at this reminder of his bygone domestic slavery Sam became invisible again, except so far as his legs were concerned. Then Jabe began with slow carefulness to recharge his pipe, saying as he did so —" Hoo's a likely wench as fur as Aw know, but women's like horses. The better they are, the mooar they wanten th' bit. Tha's nowt to do but put thy fut daan and be a mon." There was such unusual gentleness in Jabe's voice that Johnty, encouraged to be confidential, leaned forward and said, with a tremor in his voice —" Jabe, hoo's as good as hoo's pratty. There isn't a better wife in the country side. Then aw Aw've getten to say is tha'rt goin' t' reet road ta spile her. Aw tell thee, women conna stond it." Then Sam, recovering from his rebuff, joined in the conversation, and soon Johnty was listening to story after story of the humiliating sufferings which men had brought on themselves by giving way to their wives, Sam's personal reminiscences being of a specially harrowing description. All this worked on poor Johnty's well-prepared mind, and he saw more clearly than ever where he had missed his way. This thought dwelt the longer in his mind because it transferred the blame of the past to his own shoulders, and helped him to believe that in adopting the advice of his friends he would be really consulting his wife's best interests. As he went home his spirits rose. It would only be one short, sharp struggle, and then it was for Susy's own good, and would prevent worse happening in the future. He was a man, and it was cowardly to shirk his responsibilities. All this, together with the ingrained hatred of extravagance in which he had been trained, and his keen sense of wounded pride at the discovery that he and his wife were the village talk, decided him to " tak' the bull by the horns," as he phrased it, and end the matter that very night. There would be a storm, he expected, the first of their married life. Susy was more than his match in argument, and he felt that the only thing to do was to turn bully for an hour, as the easiest way of settling his difficulty. Long Ben was standing at his garden gate, smoking in the twilight as he passed, and it came into Johnty's head to consult his neighbour on the matter in hand. But remembering Ben's mildness of temper, he feared that a counsel of gentleness would be given, which would frustrate all. So he passed quickly on, and nerving himself to his great task, he opened the door with a noisy rattle to keep himself up to sticking point, and stepped firmly across the threshold. The house was in darkness, except for the red glow of the firelight, and looking round for his wife, he found her lying on a short sofa which she had drawn near the fire. She was fast asleep. Now, in picturing to himself what he would do and say when he got home, Johnty had never imagined the possibility of his wife's being asleep, and when he found her in this condition he was quite nonplussed. He paused a moment or two, reached up to the high mantelpiece and got hold of a candle, then hesitated and put it down again, and turning his back to the fire, stood looking at his little wife. She was in deep slumber and looked somewhat tired. Her small, well-poised head was thrown back a little. The perfect white of her skin gleamed in the firelight. The almost classically regular features were softened into repose, and the unhooked top of her dress gave glimpses of a round snowy neck, whilst her black hair drooped a little and almost covered a tiny white ear. She wore a light print dress, a very uncommon garment for a minder's wife's everyday use in those times, but which Susy had made herself and put on for her husband's pleasure, never dreaming how it might strike him. But Johnty never saw the dress. He was looking down upon the unconscious Susy with a world of warring thoughts passing through his brain. As he looked he held his breath, then he bent down and nearly touched her. Then he straightened himself again, heaved a great sigh, and finally, whilst his grey eyes gleamed again, he cried under his breath, " Eh, wench, but tha art bonny," and then he bent down again until his breath touched her hair, and murmured thickly, " Bless thee." The sleeping woman moved a little, and Johnty hastily drew back, whilst Susy tossed into sight plump round little arm, on which was a ridiculously small hand adorned by a wedding ring. Somehow the ring attracted the Minder's attention. He stepped forward and knelt down on a mat by the sofa side, for Susy was above sanded floors. Then he bent over and kissed the ring, murmuring as he did so, " Aw'd do it agen if I had to do it ta neet. Ay, Aw'd do it if tha cost me 10 times as mitch. Bless thee, bless thee." He noticed that he was keeping the light from his wife's face, so he moved to get it on again, and then stood over the sleeping form, regarding it intently. " Hoo's welly like an angel," he whispered. " Eh, there's nowt for wrong at th' back of a face like that." Then he moved round to the other side of the sofa to get a different angle of admiration, and standing here, he cried under his breath, " If hoo hadn't a hed some bit of a fawt, hoo'd a bin a gradely angel, and Aw should ne'er a known her." Then he began to pray. Clasping his hands and turning his face towards the ceiling, he said —" Lord, Aw took her for better or for wur, an' theer's sa mitch o' th' better abaat her Aw'll ne'er mention th' little bit o' wur ony mooar. Let owd bachelors an' henpecked widowers say wot they'n a mind. Aw winna, Aw winna." And then he stooped down, and picking up his sleeping wife as if she had been a baby, he carried her, held her to his heart, upstairs, and placing her gently on the bed, and solemnly kissing the still placid face, he cried —" Bless her, hoo's chep at ony price."